Imagine being so desperate, so forgotten by the world, that when a dying stranger stumbles into your shelter clutching a crying baby, you don't think twice about stealing bread to keep them alive. Joanna was 14 years old, starving, and invisible to everyone who passed her on the streets. She had nothing. She was nothing. But on one frozen winter night, she made a choice that would haunt her for 14 years. She saved a man and his infant daughter, never knowing their names, never asking for gratitude, never imagining that this single act of kindness would one day force her to choose between everything she'd ever dreamed of and the life of an innocent child. Now, at 28, Joanna is 3 weeks away from marrying the man who rescued her from poverty, who promised her a life of comfort and security, who gave her everything she'd been denied since birth. But when a 14-year-old princess is accused of murdering the queen and sentenced to hang, Joanna recognizes her. The baby she fed with stolen milk all those years ago. And as she watches her future husband, the king's most trusted advisor, smile while an innocent girl awaits execution, Joanna realizes something that makes her blood run cold. The man she's about to marry is the same man who tried to murder that baby 14 years ago. And she's the only person in the entire kingdom who knows the truth. But speaking up means losing everything she's fought her entire life to have. Staying silent means watching a child die for crimes she didn't commit. And the clock is ticking. The execution is in 7 days. And the evidence Joanna needs is locked in the chambers of the very man who holds her future in his hands. One choice, 7 days, and a secret that will either save a kingdom or destroy the only person brave enough to tell it. The needle slipped through Joanna's calloused finger for the 3rd time that morning, drawing a bead of blood that stained the silk she was mending. She didn't flinch. Pain had become such a constant companion over her 28 years that a pinprick barely registered anymore. What made her hands tremble wasn't the wound, but the golden thread she was stitching into the royal banner, each loop reminding her that she was invisible here, just another pair of hands in the palace sewing chamber, forgotten the moment she left each evening. The other seamstresses chattered around her like birds in a marketplace, their voices blending into meaningless noise. Joanna kept her head down, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. She had learned long ago that being noticed meant being hurt. Orphans didn't survive by standing out. They survived by becoming shadows, by making themselves so small that the world forgot to crush them. Her fingers moved mechanically through the fabric, creating perfect stitches that no one would ever praise, on garments she would never wear, for people who would never see her face. A sharp clatter of boots on stone silenced the chamber. The head seamstress, Mistress Veronica, burst through the doorway, her normally composed face twisted with something Joanna had never seen before. Genuine fear. The woman's chest heaved as though she had run up from the dungeons themselves, and her knuckles were white where she gripped the doorframe. "The Princess Anne has been arrested," Veronica gasped, and the words fell into the room like stones into still water. "They found Nightshade in the Queen's chambers. The princess is accused of murder." The silk slipped from Joanna's hands. Around her, the other women erupted into shocked whispers, but their voices seemed to come from underwater. Princess Anne, 14 years old, the same age Joanna had been when everything in her miserable life had changed one winter night. The same age she had been when she learned that sometimes saving someone meant damning yourself. Joanna's vision blurred, and suddenly she wasn't in the bright sewing chamber anymore. She was 14 again, her stomach hollow with hunger, her fingers blue with cold, huddled in the abandoned stable that served as her shelter. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, the kind of merciless winter that killed the weak, the forgotten, the unwanted. She had been all 3. The memory hit her with physical force, the sound of something heavy falling in the snow outside the stable, her terror as she pressed herself into the darkest corner, praying it wasn't the baker's son who had threatened to teach her a lesson for stealing bread crusts from behind his father's shop. The broken door creaking open, and then the sight that had carved itself into her soul. A man, barely conscious, his fine clothes torn and stained with blood, clutching a bundle of rags against his chest, a bundle that was moving, crying. A baby. "Are you listening, girl?" Mistress Veronica's sharp voice yanked Joanna back to the present. The older woman was staring directly at her, and Joanna's heart lurched. Being noticed. Being seen. Dangerous. "I said everyone must attend the public announcement in the throne room within the hour. The king himself will address the court about his daughter's treason." Joanna nodded mutely, but her mind was still trapped 14 years in the past. She remembered how the man had looked at her with feverish eyes, his lips cracked and bleeding, and whispered a single word: "Please." She remembered the weight of the infant in her arms, impossibly light, impossibly fragile. She remembered making a choice that no 14-year-old orphan should have to make. Risk everything she had, which was nothing, to save two strangers who would likely die anyway. For 3 days and 3 nights, she had kept them alive. She stole milk from the goats in the merchant's barn, risking a beating or worse. She stole bread, cheese, even a threadbare blanket from a clothesline. She fed the baby drop by drop, held her close to keep her warm, and watched the man drift in and out of consciousness, muttering about betrayal and poison and darkness closing in. On the 4th morning, soldiers had come. Not the local guards, but men in armor that gleamed even in the weak winter sun, with crests she couldn't read embroidered on their cloaks. They had taken the man and the baby without a word of explanation. One soldier had looked back at her, his face unreadable, and for a moment she thought he might say something. But he had simply turned away, and they had vanished into the snow like ghosts. Joanna had stood there shivering, empty-handed, with nothing to show for her sacrifice except the certain knowledge that she would never know what happened to the baby she had saved. Until now. The throne room was suffocating with bodies and whispers when Joanna slipped in among the crowd of servants. She positioned herself behind a marble pillar, habit making her seek the shadows even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She could see the throne from here, and the man sitting upon it. King Victor looked older than time itself, his face carved with lines of grief and rage. But it was the same face, the same sharp nose, the same deep-set eyes, the man from the stable, the man she had saved. And beside him, in chains so heavy they seemed designed to break her, stood a girl of 14 with tangled dark hair and eyes that held the same desperate terror Joanna had seen in her own reflection as a child. Princess Anne. The baby she had fed with stolen milk. The infant whose tiny fingers had gripped hers with such surprising strength. "My daughter stands accused of the most heinous crime imaginable," the king's voice boomed through the hall, and Joanna felt each word like a physical blow. "The queen, my beloved wife, was poisoned with nightshade. The poison was found hidden in Anne's chambers. There is no doubt of her guilt." No. The word screamed through Joanna's mind, but her throat had closed. She watched the princess's face, saw the girl's lips moving. In silent denial, saw the tracks of dried tears on her cheeks. 14 years old, a child. The same age Joanna had been when the world had shown her that mercy was a luxury orphans couldn't afford. "The execution will take place in 7 days," King Victor continued, and something in his voice cracked. For just a moment, he wasn't a king. He was a father watching his child die. "Unless evidence of her innocence comes forth. I pray to God that it will." The crowd erupted in murmurs, but Joanna couldn't hear them over the roaring in her ears. 7 days. The princess had 7 days to live, and Joanna was the only person in this entire kingdom who knew, with absolute certainty, that something was deeply, horrifically wrong, because she had seen it. That night, 14 years ago, when the man had been delirious with fever, when his words had tumbled out in fragments. He had spoken of nightshade. He had spoken of betrayal from within. He had clutched a silver brooch shaped like a raven and whispered, "He tried to kill me, my own blood, the raven knows." And today, at this very moment, standing 3 paces from the king, wearing robes of deep crimson with silver thread, was the king's chief counselor, Lord Hadrian, the man with the raven brooch pinned to his chest, the man who had rescued Joanna from the streets 2 years ago, the man who had given her work, shelter, food, The man who had held her when she cried from loneliness. The man who had asked her to marry him just 3 weeks ago. The man whose soft brown eyes were watching Princess Anne with an expression that made Joanna's blood turn to ice. She looked down at her left hand, at the simple silver band he had placed there when she had whispered yes. The metal suddenly felt like a shackle, like chains, like the weight around a 14-year-old girl's wrists as she waited to die for a crime she didn't commit. And Joanna realized, with a horror that made her stomach lurch, that she was the only person who could save her. But saving Princess Anne meant destroying the only good thing that had ever happened to her in her entire miserable life. It meant accusing the man she loved of attempted regicide. It meant losing everything. Again. The king dismissed the court, and people began to file out, their voices hushed and grim. Joanna stayed frozen behind the pillar, watching Lord Hadrian approach the throne, watching him place a comforting hand on King Victor's shoulder, watching him whisper something that made the king nod wearily. Lord Hadrian turned to leave, and for one terrible moment, his eyes met Joanna's across the crowded room. He smiled, that gentle, loving smile that had made her believe, for the first time in her life, that she deserved happiness. Then he walked past her, and the scent of nightshade clung to his robes like a promise of death. The smell of nightshade followed Joanna through the palace corridors like a ghost she couldn't outrun. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, watching servants hurry past with their heads down and their mouths shut. Fear had settled over the castle like fog, thick and suffocating. No one wanted to be noticed. No one wanted to be next. Joanna's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She clutched them together, feeling the silver band on her finger dig into her skin. 3 weeks ago, when Hadrian had slipped that ring onto her hand in the garden behind the chapel, she had cried, not the bitter tears she had shed so many times before, but tears of disbelief that something good could actually happen to her. He had kissed her forehead and whispered that she would never be alone again, that she would never be hungry again, that she would never have to steal or hide or sleep in the cold. She had believed him. God help her, she had believed every word. Now that same ring felt like it was burning through her flesh, marking her as complicit in something unspeakable. Her mind kept replaying the moment their eyes had met in the throne room. That smile, that gentle, loving smile that she had treasured for 2 years. But now, behind it, she saw something else. Something she had been too desperate, too grateful, too starved for affection to see before. Calculation. The sewing chamber was empty when she stumbled back inside. The other seamstresses had fled to their quarters, eager to gossip about the princess's arrest behind closed doors where loose tongues wouldn't get them imprisoned. Joanna sank onto her wooden stool, her legs finally giving out. The royal banner she had been mending lay crumpled on the floor, the golden thread tangled and ruined. She needed to think. She needed to remember. But her thoughts scattered like frightened birds every time she tried to grasp them. 14 years ago, the man in the stable, the baby, the fever dreams. What exactly had he said? Joanna closed her eyes, forcing herself back into that frozen night, into that terrified 14-year-old girl's skin. The man had been barely conscious, his body burning with fever despite the cold. She had pressed snow against his forehead, trying to cool him down, and his hand had shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "The raven," he had gasped, his eyes wild and unfocused. "The raven brought the nightshade, my own blood, my brother's son. He wants the throne. He wants my daughter dead." At the time, Joanna hadn't understood. She was an illiterate orphan who didn't even know who the king was, let alone his family tree. The words had been meaningless sounds from a dying man's lips, but she remembered them. She remembered everything from those 3 days because it had been the only time in her short, brutal life that she had felt like she mattered, like her existence had purpose. Brother's son, the king's nephew. Joanna's breath caught in her throat. She stood abruptly, her stool clattering backward. Lord Hadrian, the king's chief counselor. She had never thought to question his position, his proximity to power. Servants didn't question such things, but now, with the clarity of horror, she understood. Hadrian was the king's nephew. The old king's brother had died in a hunting accident 20 years ago, leaving behind a young son who had been raised at court, groomed for service, always close to the throne but never quite able to sit upon it, unless the direct line was eliminated. The queen, dead from nightshade poisoning. Princess Anne, accused and awaiting execution. Once the princess was gone, who would inherit? The king was 63 years old, far too old to remarry and produce more heirs. The crown would pass to the next male relative, to Hadrian. Joanna's stomach heaved. She pressed her fist against her mouth, tasting bile. He had tried to kill the king 14 years ago. The poison had been meant for King Victor, but something had gone wrong. Maybe the king had grown suspicious. Maybe he had fled with his infant daughter to protect her. And Hadrian had waited, bided his time, gained trust, risen to power, and tried again. But this time, he was clever. This time, he didn't try to kill the king directly. He killed the queen and framed the princess. The grief would destroy King Victor from within, and when he died broken and childless, the crown would fall into Hadrian's waiting hands like ripe fruit. The door to the sewing chamber creaked open, and Joanna spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Hadrian stood in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by torchlight from the corridor. He looked every inch the concerned nobleman, his handsome face etched with appropriate sorrow. In his hands he carried a small basket covered with white cloth. "My love," he said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I've been looking for you. I thought you might be hungry. You left the throne room so quickly." Joanna couldn't speak. Her tongue felt like leather in her mouth. She watched him approach, his movements graceful and unhurried, and fought the instinct to run. Where would she run to? She was nobody, an orphan seamstress with no family, no friends, no allies. He was the king's trusted counselor, beloved by the court, respected by the nobles. "You're trembling," Hadrian observed, setting the basket on the work table. He reached for her hands, and she forced herself not to flinch when his fingers closed around hers. His touch was warm, familiar, the same touch that had held her when she woke from nightmares. "This terrible business with the princess has shaken everyone, but justice will be served. The guilty will be punished." There was something in the way he said "guilty" that made Joanna's skin crawl, a slight emphasis, a warning. She looked up at his face, searching for the monster she now knew lived beneath that handsome exterior. But all she saw was concern, tenderness, love, or a perfect imitation of it. "I keep thinking about her," Joanna whispered, testing. "Princess Anne. She's so young. Only 14. Evil knows no age," Hadrian replied smoothly. He released one of her hands to brush a strand of hair from her face. Some people are born with darkness in their hearts. The princess always resented her stepmother. Everyone at court knew it. Liar, Joanna thought. But she nodded, playing the part of the trusting bride-to-be. "Of course. You're right. I'm always right, my darling." He smiled, and this time she saw it clearly. The coldness behind his eyes. The satisfaction of a predator who thinks his prey is already caught. "In 3 more weeks, you'll be my wife. We'll leave this sad business behind us. I've arranged for us to have chambers in the East Wing, overlooking the Rose Garden. You'll never have to sew another stitch unless you want to. You'll be Lady Joanna." Lady Joanna. She would have a title, a name, an identity beyond orphan and seamstress. Everything she had ever dreamed of as a starving child sleeping in stables. All she had to do was let an innocent 14-year-old girl die. "That sounds wonderful," she heard herself say. The words tasted like poison. Hadrian leaned down and kissed her forehead, the same tender gesture he had made when he proposed. "Eat something, my love. You look pale. I must return to the king. He's not well. This has broken him." There was no sympathy in Hadrian's voice, only satisfaction poorly disguised as concern. He left, closing the door softly behind him. The moment he was gone, Joanna collapsed onto her stool, her whole body shaking so violently her teeth chattered. She stared at the basket he had brought. Under the white cloth she could see bread, cheese, grapes. A feast for someone who had grown up stealing crusts. She didn't touch it. Instead, she looked at the ring on her finger, this symbol of everything she had ever wanted. Security, love, belonging, a lie. All of it, a lie. The question that haunted her wasn't whether Hadrian was guilty. She knew he was. The question was, what was she going to do about it? If she went to the king with her story, who would believe her? An orphan seamstress accusing the king's most trusted advisor based on the fever dreams of a dying man from 14 years ago. She had no proof, no evidence, nothing but memories and instinct. They would call her mad. Or worse, they would think she was trying to save the princess for some ulterior motive. They might even accuse her of being an accomplice. But if she said nothing, Princess Anne would die in 7 days. 6 now. The girl who had gripped her finger with tiny infant hands. The baby she had kept alive with stolen milk and desperate prayers. Joanna stood and walked to the narrow window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere in the dungeons below, a 14-year-old girl was sitting in chains, waiting to die for a crime she didn't commit. Wondering why no one believed her. Wondering if anyone cared. Joanna knew exactly how that felt. She pulled the ring from her finger. It came off easily, leaving a pale band of skin beneath. She set it on the work table beside the untouched basket of food and stared at it for a long moment. Then she put it back on. Not because she had forgiven Hadrian, not because she had chosen safety over justice, but because she had just realized something that made her blood run cold. If Hadrian suspected for even a moment that she knew the truth, she would be dead before sunrise. The only way to save Princess Anne was to make him believe she was still his devoted, grateful, oblivious bride. She had to become invisible again, a shadow, someone too insignificant to fear. And while he wasn't looking, she had to find proof that would destroy him. The castle never truly slept, but in the hours before dawn, it came as close as it ever would. Joanna moved through the darkened corridors like smoke, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. She had learned to walk without sound during her years. On the streets, when the difference between silence and noise meant the difference between eating and starving, between sleeping and being violated. Those skills, buried under 2 years of relative safety, came flooding back now with terrifying ease. Hadrian's private chambers were in the North Tower, 3 floors above the main hall. Joanna had been there only twice before, both times during daylight hours when he had invited her to see the rooms that would soon be hers. She remembered the heavy oak door, the iron lock, the way sunlight streamed through the tall windows and made everything look warm and safe. She remembered thinking that she would finally have a home. Now, clutching a stolen candle in one hand and a ring of keys she had lifted from the head housekeeper's belt in the other, she understood that what she had mistaken for warmth was simply gilding on a cage. Her heart hammered so violently against her ribs that she was certain someone would hear it. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every distant sound made her freeze, pressing herself against the wall, barely breathing. But the castle guards were focused on the dungeons tonight, making sure the princess didn't somehow escape. No one was watching for a seamstress creeping through the darkness. The lock on Hadrian's door resisted the first 3 keys. Joanna's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the ring. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. What was she even looking for? Evidence. Proof. Something, anything that would tie him to the Queen's murder. But what did proof even look like? She was an illiterate orphan who couldn't read the documents she might find, couldn't understand the politics she was entangling herself in. The 4th key turned with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silence. Joanna slipped inside and closed the door behind her, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room was exactly as she remembered, richly furnished with dark wood and velvet. Shelves lined with leather-bound books, a desk positioned near the window. But now, instead of seeing beauty, she saw the trappings of ambition. Every expensive item in this room had been purchased with proximity to power, with service to a king that Hadrian was methodically destroying. She set the candle on the desk, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. Where would he keep evidence of treason? Was she being foolish, thinking he would be careless enough to leave proof lying around? Men like Hadrian didn't survive by making mistakes. But then again, men like Hadrian also didn't expect orphan seamstresses to break into their chambers in the middle of the night. Joanna started with the desk drawers. The first contained correspondence, official documents with wax seals she couldn't read. She shuffled through them carefully, looking for something, though she didn't know what. The second drawer held an ornate dagger with a jeweled handle, accounting ledgers, a half-finished letter. The third drawer was locked. Her pulse quickened. Locked meant hidden. Hidden meant important. She tried the keys again, but none of them fit. The lock was smaller, more delicate, not meant for a housekeeper's ring. She sat back on her heels, frustration building in her chest. She was running out of time. Dawn would come soon, and with it, the servants who would notice her absence. Then she remembered. Hadrian wore a chain around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. She had felt it once when they embraced, a small key resting against his chest. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Now it seemed to glow in her memory like a beacon. The key was here. It had to be. He wouldn't carry something that important with him at all times. Too risky if someone noticed. Too obvious. Joanna's eyes swept the room, searching. Where would she hide something precious if she were him? Somewhere close. Somewhere he could see it, touch it, reassure himself it was safe. Her gaze landed on the bookshelf, on a small wooden box carved with ravens. Ravens. His symbol. The same raven on the brooch he wore. She grabbed the box with trembling hands. It wasn't locked, which almost made her laugh. The most important hiding place, protected only by the assumption that no one would dare look. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a small silver key. The locked drawer opened with barely a whisper of resistance. Inside was a leather journal, its pages filled with handwriting that Joanna couldn't decipher. But she didn't need to read words to understand what she was seeing. Pressed between the pages were dried flowers. Not roses or lilies or any of the beautiful blooms that grew in the castle gardens. These were different. Dark stems, purple black berries, dried and preserved. Bell-shaped flowers that even in death seemed to radiate poison. Nightshade. Joanna's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the journal. Here it was, physical evidence. He had kept samples of the poison, pressed like treasured memories in his private journal. But why? Why would someone committing murder keep proof of their crime? Unless he was documenting something. Planning. Recording. She flipped through the pages desperately, searching for something she could understand without being able to read. Dates, numbers, anything. And then she saw it. A sketch. Rough but detailed. A floor plan of the castle. The queen's chambers marked with an X. A route traced in ink from the servants. Staircase to the bedchamber. Times noted in the margins. Guard rotations, she realized. He had mapped out exactly when the corridors would be empty. And in the corner of the page, another sketch. A young girl's face. Princess Anne, with a noose drawn around her neck. Joanna's stomach lurched. She pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from crying out. This wasn't just evidence of the queen's murder. This was a complete plan, documentation of every step, the pride of a man who thought himself untouchable. The arrogance of someone who believed no one would ever dare look. She had to take it, had to bring it to someone who could read, who would understand, who would believe her. But who? The king. How would she even get an audience with him? She was nobody. And Hadrian was always at his side, whispering poison in his ear, just as surely as he had poured it into the queen's wine. A sound in the corridor outside made Joanna's blood turn to ice. Footsteps, heavy boots on stone, getting closer. She shoved the journal back into the drawer, locked it, replaced the key in the wooden box. Her hands fumbled with the keys to the main door, nearly dropping them twice. The footsteps were right outside now. Any second the door would open, and she would be discovered, and everything would be over. The candle. She had left the candle burning on the desk. Joanna lunged for it, snatched it up, hot wax spilling over her fingers. She bit down on her tongue to keep from crying out at the pain. The door handle began to turn. She had nowhere to hide. The room was too open, too exposed. If the guard came inside, she was finished. But the door didn't open fully. Through the crack, she heard a voice. "Lord Hadrian's chambers are secure, sir. No disturbances." "Check again." Another voice responded. "The king wants every room searched. If there are accomplices to the princess's crime, we'll find them." Accomplices. They were searching for evidence that Princess Anne hadn't acted alone, and here Joanna stood, in the private chambers of the real murderer, holding proof that could save an innocent girl's life. The guard pushed the door open wider, and Joanna pressed herself behind it, her heart stopping completely. She could see his shadow falling across the floor, see the torchlight from the corridor spilling into the room. One more step, one glance to the side, that's all it would take. "Room's empty," the guard announced, moving to the next floor. The door closed. The footsteps receded. Joanna remained frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Her legs had turned to water. The candle in her hand shook so violently that wax dripped onto the floor, each drop sounding impossibly loud. She had to get out. Now. Before they came back. Before her luck ran out. She cracked the door open, peered into the corridor. Empty. Silent. She slipped out, locked the door behind her with shaking hands, and ran. Not walked, ran. Through the shadows, down the servants' staircase, back toward the sewing chamber where she was supposed to be sleeping on the narrow cot in the corner. She made it halfway there before she realized her mistake. The keys. She still had the housekeeper's keys clutched in her fist. They were supposed to be hanging on the hook outside the kitchen. If they were discovered missing, there would be an investigation. Questions. And eventually, someone would remember seeing Joanna near the kitchen earlier that evening. Joanna's breath came in. Gasps as she changed direction, heading toward the kitchen. Her burned fingers throbbed. Her feet were numb from the cold stone. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to hide, to sleep, to stop this madness before it killed her. But she couldn't stop, because she had seen it now. The journal, the nightshade, the sketch of Anne with a noose around her neck. In 6 more days, that sketch would become reality unless Joanna found a way to stop it. She hung the keys back on their hook just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the kitchen windows. A scullery maid would arrive any moment to start the morning fires. Joanna fled back to the sewing chamber, collapsed onto her cot, and pulled the thin blanket over her head. Her mind raced. She had found proof, but she couldn't read it. She knew Hadrian was guilty, but she couldn't prove it without revealing she had broken into his chambers. She wanted to save Princess Anne, but doing so would mean sacrificing the only chance at a decent life she had ever had. And underneath all of that, a smaller, more insidious thought. What if she just did nothing? What if she married Hadrian in 3 weeks, became Lady Joanna, and spent the rest of her life pretending she hadn't seen what she had seen? People did it all the time. Turned blind eyes to evil in exchange for comfort. Would it really be so wrong to choose herself, just this once, after a lifetime of suffering? Yes, a voice in her head whispered. A voice that sounded like her 14-year-old self, shivering in a stable, making the choice to save a dying man and his baby, even though it might cost her everything. It would be wrong, and she already knew she wouldn't be able to live with herself if she let it happen. But knowing what was right and knowing how to do it were 2 entirely different things. Joanna's fingers bled onto the silk she was mending, tiny drops of crimson spreading across the white fabric like accusations. She had pricked herself 7 times in the past hour, her hands too unsteady to hold the needle properly. Sleep had been impossible after her midnight expedition to Hadrian's chambers. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pressed nightshade flowers, the sketch of Princess Anne with the noose, the careful documentation of murder written in a hand she couldn't read. 5 days. Princess Anne had 5 days left to live. The other seamstresses had stopped trying to make conversation with her. They whispered among themselves, shooting her nervous glances, as though her association with Lord Hadrian made her somehow complicit in the princess's crimes. Or perhaps they sensed something else, something more dangerous, that Joanna knew too much. She had to find someone who could read the journal, someone trustworthy, someone who wouldn't immediately report her to Hadrian or the guards. But who? The castle was full of people who could read, nobles and clergy and educated merchants' sons, but every single one of them would question why a seamstress was making such accusations against the king's most trusted advisor. They would ask how she obtained this information. They would call her a liar or a madwoman, or worse, unless she went to someone who had no love for the current order, someone who had as much to lose as she did, someone who understood what it meant to be powerless. The answer came to her with such sudden clarity that she dropped her needle entirely. The other prisoners. Princess Anne wasn't being held. Alone in the dungeons. The cells were full of people accused of crimes both real and imagined. Thieves, debtors, those who had spoken against the crown. People who lived in the shadows, just as Joanna had. People who survived by seeing things others missed. If anyone had witnessed something unusual in the days before the Queen's death, it would be them. Servants and laborers who worked in areas nobles never noticed. People invisible to those in power. But getting into the dungeons would be impossible. They were heavily guarded now, with the princess's execution looming. No one was allowed near the cells except the guards and the priest who came to offer hollow prayers to the condemned. The priest. Joanna's heart began to race. Father Matthias. She had seen him twice, an elderly man with kind eyes who sometimes blessed the servants during morning mass. He walked freely through the castle, beyond suspicion, trusted by everyone. If she could convince him to help her, to ask questions, to listen. But why would he believe her? And even if he did, what could an old priest do against someone as powerful as Hadrian? The answer was nothing. He could do nothing. Unless Joanna gave him something he couldn't ignore. She needed to get back into Hadrian's chambers. She needed the journal itself, or at least pages from it. Physical evidence that Father Matthias could read and understand. Evidence that would force him to act, regardless of how impossible her story seemed. The thought of returning to that room made her throat close with fear. She had barely escaped detection the first time. Going back was madness, suicide. But what choice did she have? Joanna. The voice made her jump so violently that she knocked over her sewing basket, thread spilling across the floor in colorful tangles. Hadrian stood in the doorway of the sewing chamber, his tall frame blocking out the light from the corridor. How long had he been watching her? "My lord," she stammered, dropping into a clumsy curtsy. Her mind raced. Did he know? Had he discovered signs of her intrusion? Had the wax she spilled been noticed? Or the drawer not quite locked properly? Or any of 1,000 small mistakes she might have made in her panic? "You look exhausted," Hadrian said, his voice full of concern as he crossed the room toward her. The other seamstresses had gone silent, watching this interaction with barely concealed curiosity. "Have you been sleeping?" "The princess's situation troubles me," Joanna replied carefully. It was the truth, if not the complete truth. "I keep thinking about her in those dungeons." Something flickered across Hadrian's face, too quick to identify. "Your compassion does you credit, my darling. But you mustn't let it consume you. The princess made her choice when she poisoned the queen. Justice must be served." There was a challenge in his words, subtle but unmistakable. He was testing her, watching for any sign that she doubted the official story. Joanna forced herself to meet his eyes, to let him see nothing but the devoted, grateful woman he expected. "Of course," she murmured. "You're right. You're always right." The tension in Hadrian's shoulders eased slightly. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture of such casual intimacy that it made her skin crawl. I came to tell you that I must travel to the northern estates tomorrow. The king is sending me to secure grain shipments for the winter. I'll be gone for 3 days. 3 days. He would be gone for 3 days. Joanna's pulse thundered in her ears, but she kept her expression neutral, disappointed. So long? I'm afraid so. But when I return, we'll have only 2 weeks until our wedding. He smiled, and she saw the calculation behind it. He was watching her reaction, measuring her devotion. Can you bear to be without me for such a short time? Barely, she lied, and the word felt like ash on her tongue. Hadrian leaned down and kissed her forehead, the gesture almost paternal. My faithful Joanna, so constant, so loyal. It's one of the things I treasure most about you. You understand your place in the world. You don't reach beyond your station or question those wiser than yourself. The condescension in his words was breathtaking. He didn't just think she was obedient. He thought she was stupid, incapable of complex thought. A grateful orphan who would accept whatever scraps he threw her way and never dare to bite the hand that fed her. He had underestimated her, and that mistake might be the only advantage she had. I'll miss you terribly, Joanna said softly, letting her voice tremble just enough to sound genuine. Please be safe on the roads. Always. He straightened, adjusting his cloak. The raven brooch gleamed on his chest, seeming to stare at her with its jeweled eye. I'll send word when I arrive. Be good while I'm gone. Be good. As though she were a child or a pet. The moment he left, the other seamstresses erupted into excited whispers. How romantic, they said. How devoted he was to her. How lucky she was to be marrying such an important man. Joanna nodded and smiled and said nothing, her mind already racing ahead. 3 days. She had 3 days while Hadrian was gone to get back into his chambers, retrieve evidence from the journal, convince Father Matthias to help her, and somehow find a way to save Princess Anne without destroying herself in the process. 4 days until the execution, 3 days of Hadrian's absence. The timing was almost too perfect, which meant it probably wasn't perfect at all, which meant this might be another test, another way for him to measure her loyalty. Perhaps he wasn't really traveling north. Perhaps he would be watching, waiting to see if she took advantage of his absence. Or perhaps she was being paranoid, seeing conspiracy and coincidence. Either way, she had no choice but to act. That night, Joanna lay on her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the castle settling into darkness. She thought about Princess Anne, alone in her cell, counting down the hours until her death. She thought about the king, grieving his wife and preparing to execute his only child. She thought about all the people who would suffer if Hadrian succeeded, if his careful plan came to fruition and he claimed the crown through murder and manipulation. And she thought about herself, about the life she could have if she just stayed silent. Lady Joanna. A title. A home. Security for the first time in her 28 years of existence. All purchased with the blood of an innocent girl. She had been that girl once. 14 years old, alone, desperate, certain that no one in the world cared whether she lived or died. And then a dying man and his baby had stumbled into her shelter, and she had made a choice that defied all logic and self-preservation. She had chosen to help them, even though it gained her nothing, even though it could have killed her. That choice had defined her. It had been the one moment in her miserable childhood when she had been something other than a victim, when she had been a person who mattered, who had agency, who could change someone's fate. She couldn't abandon that now, couldn't betray the girl she had been, the man she had saved, the baby she had fed with stolen milk, even if it cost her everything, even if it killed her. Tomorrow, Hadrian would leave for the north, and tomorrow night, Joanna would break into his chambers again. This time, she wouldn't just look at the evidence. She would take it. She would bring it to Father Matthias. She would force someone, anyone, to listen. And if they didn't believe her, if they arrested her for theft and false accusations, If Hadrian returned and had her executed for her betrayal, at least she would die knowing she had tried, that she hadn't chosen comfort over conscience, that she hadn't let another innocent child die while she stood by and did nothing. The moon rose outside her small window, casting silver light across the stone walls. Somewhere in the castle, Hadrian was packing for his journey, confident in his control, certain that his simple seamstress bride would never dare question him. Somewhere in the dungeons, Princess Anne was praying for a miracle that would never come. And somewhere between those two certainties, Joanna was planning an act of such reckless courage that it would either save them all or destroy her completely. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing it was futile. In 4 days, one way or another, everything would be decided. Either Princess Anne would hang, or Hadrian would fall, or Joanna would die trying to make things right. There was no path that led to safety anymore. There was only the choice between different kinds of destruction, and Joanna had already made her choice. The sky was still bruised with dawn when Joanna watched Hadrian's carriage disappear through the castle gates, his raven banner snapping in the cold wind. She stood at the narrow window of the sewing chamber, her breath fogging the glass, and counted to 100 before she allowed herself to move. Even then, her body felt frozen, every muscle locked with the certainty that this was a trap, that he was watching somehow, that the moment she acted, he would materialize behind her like a demon summoned by treachery. But the corridor remained empty when she stepped into it. The castle had settled into its morning rhythm. Servants hurrying to their duties, nobles breaking their fast in the great hall, guards changing shifts at their posts. No one noticed one seamstress moving through the shadows. No one ever did. Joanna's plan was simple, which meant it was almost certainly doomed to fail. She would wait until nightfall, return to Hadrian's chambers, take pages from the journal that clearly showed his guilt, and bring them to Father Matthias before the morning mass. The priest would read the evidence, understand the truth, and go to the king. Princess Anne would be freed. Hadrian would be arrested upon his return. Justice would prevail. Simple, impossible, suicidal. But it was the only plan she had. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Joanna's hands shook so badly that Mistress Veronica finally sent her away from the sewing, snapping that her work was unusable and she was wasting expensive thread. Joanna fled to the kitchens where she volunteered to help prepare vegetables, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into panic. The cook, a massive woman with flour-dusted arms, looked at her with surprising gentleness. "You're Lord Hadrian's girl, aren't you?" the cook asked, and Joanna nodded mutely. Terrible business with the princess. Must be hard on him having to leave at such a time. He and the king are very close. Yes, Joanna managed. Very close. Still, the cook continued, lowering her voice and glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. There are some in the kitchen who remember the old days. Before the queen died, they say the princess adored her stepmother, followed her everywhere like a little shadow. Seems strange that such devotion would turn to murder so quickly. Joanna's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" The cook shrugged, but her eyes were sharp. "Just seems strange is all. But then, what do I know? I'm just an old woman who cooks food and hears too much gossip." She handed Joanna a knife and a pile of turnips. "Here, keep yourself busy. Idle hands make troubled thoughts." But the cook's words had planted something in Joanna's mind, a seed of possibility. There were others who doubted. Others who had seen Princess Anne's relationship with her stepmother and found the accusations hard to believe. She wasn't alone in her suspicions, even if she was the only one who knew the truth. The question was, how many others felt the same way? And more importantly, would any of them be brave enough to speak up? As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Joanna made her way toward the chapel. Father Matthias would be there, preparing for evening prayers. She needed to speak with him before tonight, needed to prepare him for what was coming, even if she couldn't yet show him the evidence. If she simply appeared with stolen documents in the middle of the night, he might turn her away as a madwoman or a thief. The chapel was empty except for the priest, who knelt before the altar with his weathered hands clasped in prayer. He was older than Joanna had realized, perhaps 70 years, his white hair thin and his shoulders bent. For a moment, she doubted her plan entirely. What could this old man do against someone as powerful and ruthless as Hadrian? But then Father Matthias looked up, and his eyes, pale blue and startlingly clear, met hers with such direct understanding that she felt stripped bare. "Child," he said softly, "you carry a heavy burden. I can see it in the way you stand, as though the weight might crush you." At any moment, Joanna's throat closed. She hadn't expected kindness, hadn't expected to be seen. For so long, she had been invisible. And now this stranger was looking at her as though he could read every desperate thought in her head. "Father," she whispered, moving closer, "I need to confess something, but it's not a sin. It's a truth that no one wants to hear." The priest's expression didn't change, but he gestured to the pew beside him. "Sit, child. God hears all truths, wanted or not." Joanna sat, her hands twisted together in her lap. How did she even begin? How did she explain without sounding insane? "The princess," she started, then stopped. Started again. "Princess Anne. She's innocent." Father Matthias was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "That is a serious claim. The evidence against her is substantial. The evidence was planted." The words tumbled out now, unstoppable. "By someone who wants the crown. Someone who tried to kill the king 14 years ago and failed, and now is trying again by different means. You have proof of this?" "I will, tonight. But I need you to promise that if I bring you evidence, you'll look at it. You'll read it. You'll consider that I might be telling the truth, even though I'm just a seamstress, and the person I'm accusing is—" She stopped, fear choking off the name. "Lord Hadrian." Father Matthias finished quietly. "You're betrothed." Joanna's head snapped up. "How did you—" "I am old, child, but not blind. I have watched Lord Hadrian for many years. I have seen how he moves through this castle like a player on a stage, always performing, always calculating, and I have prayed for discernment about him, because there is something about that man that troubles my soul, even though I cannot name what it is." The priest's hands tightened on his prayer beads. "But knowing something in your heart and proving it in the world are very different things. If you make this accusation, without irrefutable proof, he will destroy you, and I will be powerless to stop him." "I know," Joanna said, "but I have to try. Because I was there, Father. 14 years ago. I was the one who saved the king when he fled the palace. I was the one who fed his baby daughter with stolen milk. And I heard him, in his fever, name his would-be murderer. The man with the raven symbol. The man who brought nightshade." Father Matthias's face had gone very still. "You were the one. The girl in the stable. The king has spoken of you, though he never learned your name. He said an angel saved his life that night. I was no angel. I was a starving orphan who made a choice." Joanna's eyes burned with unshed tears. "And now that baby is going to die for a crime she didn't commit, and I'm the only one who can stop it. So I need you to trust me, Father. I need you to believe that I'm not mad or vengeful or trying to escape my marriage. I need you to believe that I'm telling the truth." The priest studied her face for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. "Bring me your evidence tonight. After midnight, when the castle sleeps, come to the sacristy door. I will be waiting. And if what you show me proves what you claim, I will go to the king myself, regardless of the consequences." Relief flooded through Joanna so powerfully that she nearly sobbed. "Thank you, thank you." "Don't thank me yet, child. We are both walking into darkness, and we may not survive what we find there." "Father." Matthias placed a weathered hand on her head in blessing. "But sometimes the only way to reach the light is to pass through the shadow of death itself. God go with you." Joanna left the chapel as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and amber. 3 more days until Princess Anne's execution. 3 more days until Hadrian returned. And tonight, one chance to steal the evidence that would either save them all or condemn her to a death far worse than hanging. The hours until midnight stretched like years. Joanna returned to the sewing chamber, lay on her cot with her eyes open, and listened to the castle settle into sleep around her. The other seamstress's breathing deepened and slowed. The guards' footsteps passed by at regular intervals. The distant sounds of nobles retiring to their chambers faded into silence. When the cathedral bells tolled midnight, Joanna rose like a ghost and began her journey through the darkened corridors for the second time. This time she knew where the guards would be. This time she moved with purpose rather than blind panic. This time she wasn't just searching for evidence. She was stealing it, committing an act of treason that would be punishable by death if she was caught. The lock on Hadrian's door opened more easily now that her hands weren't shaking quite as badly. She slipped inside, closed the door behind her, and lit her candle with steady fingers. The room looked exactly as it had before. Dark wood, velvet curtains, shelves of books. But now she knew what it really was. A murderer's lair, decorated with the spoils of manipulation and betrayal. The wooden box with the ravens still sat on the shelf. The small silver key still waited inside. And the locked drawer still held the journal that would either save Princess Anne or sign Joanna's death warrant. She opened the drawer and lifted out the leather-bound book, her heart hammering. How many pages should she take? Too few, and the evidence might not be convincing. Too many, and Hadrian would notice immediately upon his return. Her hands moved almost without conscious thought, carefully tearing out 3 pages. The sketch of Princess Anne with the noose. A page detailing the guard rotations and the route to the Queen's chambers. And a page that she couldn't read, but that seemed to contain a list of names and dates, potentially other victims or co-conspirators. The sound of tearing parchment seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Joanna folded the pages carefully, tucked them inside her bodice against her skin, and returned the journal to its drawer. Her hands moved mechanically through the motions, locking the drawer, replacing the key in the wooden box, positioning everything exactly as it had been. She was halfway to the door when she heard it. Footsteps in the corridor outside. Not the measured tread of guards on patrol, but something faster, more purposeful. Coming closer. Coming to this door. Joanna's blood turned to ice. It was impossible. Hadrian was 3 days' ride away, but the footsteps stopped directly outside the chamber, and she heard the unmistakable sound of a key entering a lock. Someone was entering the room, and Joanna had nowhere to hide. Joanna's candle went out as she dropped behind Hadrian's desk, her hand clamped over her mouth to silence the scream clawing up her throat. Darkness swallowed the room whole, broken only by the thin line of torchlight seeping under the door. The key scraped in the lock. Metal against metal. Each sound a hammer blow against her ribs. She pressed herself into the smallest space possible, her body folded beneath the desk's solid wood frame, the stolen pages burning against her skin like brands. The door swung open. Footsteps entered, but they weren't Hadrian's measured stride. These steps were quicker, lighter. A woman's steps. Joanna's lungs screamed for air, but she didn't dare breathe. Through the narrow gap between the desk and floor, she could see the hem of a dark cloak, mud-splattered and travel-worn. The figure moved to the window, and moonlight caught the edge of a face. Not Hadrian. A woman, perhaps 40 years old, her features sharp and angular, her hair pulled back severely. She wore the plain dress of a servant, but something in the way she carried herself spoke of education, of breeding carefully hidden beneath common cloth. Joanna had never seen her before. The woman went directly to the bookshelf, her movements confident and practiced. She knew exactly where to look. She pulled down the wooden box with the ravens, extracted the small silver key, and within moments had the locked drawer open. The journal came out, and the woman flipped through its pages with shocking familiarity, her lips moving silently as she read. Then she stopped. Her entire body went rigid. "No," the woman whispered. "No, no, no." Her hands were shaking now as she held the journal up to the moonlight, examining it more closely. "Pages are missing. 3 pages. He'll know. God above, he'll know someone was here. Joanna's heart stopped. This woman knew about the journal, knew about Hadrian's secrets, which meant she was either an accomplice or another victim of his schemes. Either way, Joanna was trapped in a room with someone who could destroy her with a single scream. The woman paced, her breathing rapid and panicked. Think, Margaret, think. He returns in 2 days. If he discovers this before you can act, everything is lost. Mother of God, everything is already lost. Margaret. The name meant nothing to Joanna, but the terror in the woman's voice was intimately familiar. This was someone who understood exactly how dangerous Hadrian was, someone who had reason to fear him. Margaret moved to the desk, so close that Joanna could have reached out and touched her skirts. The woman leaned against the wood, her hands braced on the surface directly above Joanna's head. The seamstress, Margaret muttered. It has to be the seamstress. No one else has access to these rooms. No one else would dare. But why would she take evidence against him unless... The woman's breath caught. Unless she knows. Unless she remembers. Joanna's mind raced. This woman knew who she was, knew about her relationship with Hadrian, and somehow, impossibly, seemed to know about Joanna's past connection to the king. If she's taken this to someone, Margaret continued, speaking to herself in the darkness. If she's already gone to the king or the guards, then I'm too late. But if she hasn't yet, if she's still gathering courage or waiting for the right moment, then there might still be time to... She stopped mid-sentence, turned slowly, and looked directly at the desk. You're here, aren't you? Margaret's voice had changed, become softer, almost gentle, hiding, listening, terrified. I would be too. She moved to the side of the desk, crouched down, and peered into the shadows beneath. Her eyes met Joanna's, and neither woman moved. Come out, child. I'm not going to hurt you. In fact, I think we might be the only 2 people in this entire castle who want the same thing. Joanna didn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Margaret blocked the only escape route. My name is Margaret Thorne, the woman said quietly. 20 years ago, I was lady-in-waiting to the king's first wife, Queen Elizabeth. I was there when Princess Anne was born. I was there when the queen died of childbed fever 3 months later, and I was there when Lord Hadrian, then just a young courtier hungry for power, began his first attempt to seize the throne. Joanna's breath came in short, shallow gasps. This woman had been there, had witnessed everything. I know you're the girl from the stable, Margaret continued. The king described you many times over the years. A child with dark hair and eyes like bruises, wearing rags, smelling of goats and desperation. He said you saved his life with nothing but stolen bread and kindness. He's been searching for you for 14 years, you know. Wanted to reward you, but you'd vanished like smoke. Who are you? Joanna finally managed to whisper. I told you. I was the queen's lady. But after she died, I became something else. I became a ghost, haunting the edges of the court, watching Hadrian, documenting his crimes, waiting for the right moment to act. Margaret's face hardened. I loved Queen Elizabeth like a sister, and when I realized that her death wasn't fever at all, that Hadrian had poisoned her to remove the king's support system and isolate him, I vowed I would see him destroyed. But he's clever, so clever. Every move carefully planned, every witness either bought or buried. Joanna emerged slowly from beneath the desk, her legs cramping, her whole body trembling. She stood facing Margaret, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other. You've been collecting evidence against him, Joanna said. It wasn't a question. For 20 years. But it's never enough. He's too careful, too protected. And now he's made his final move. Killed the current queen, framed the princess, and positioned himself perfectly to inherit when the king dies of grief. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. I've tried everything. I've gone to the king's advisors, but Hadrian has them all in his pocket. I've tried to warn the king himself, but I'm just a former lady-in-waiting who disappeared from court decades ago. No one will listen to me. But they might listen to, me, Joanna said slowly. Understanding dawned like terrible sunlight. Because I'm his betrothed. Because I have access to him. Because no one would believe I'd betray the man who rescued me from poverty unless I had irrefutable proof. Exactly. Margaret pulled out a small leather satchel from beneath her cloak. I've been gathering my own evidence, separate from his journal. Testimony from servants who've disappeared. Records of suspicious deaths. Financial documents showing payments to assassins. But I needed something from his personal effects. Something in his own hand that proves his guilt beyond doubt. The journal pages you took, those will work. Combined with what I have, it might be enough. Might be? Margaret's expression was grim. Hadrian has spent 2 decades building his reputation. He's beloved at court, trusted by the king, seen as a loyal servant of the crown. Accusing him of multiple murders and treason, even with evidence, is like trying to convince people. The sun won't rise. They don't want to believe it. They'll fight against believing it because accepting it means their entire world is built on lies. Joanna pulled the folded pages from inside her bodice. They felt heavier than they should, weighted with the lives they represented. I was going to take these to Father Matthias tonight. He's waiting for me at the sacristy. Good, that's good. Father Matthias is one of the few people in this castle Hadrian hasn't corrupted. Margaret took the pages with reverent care, examining them in the moonlight. Her face went pale as she recognized the sketch of Princess Anne with the noose. Mother of God. He drew this. He sketched her death like an artist planning a masterpiece. What do we do? Joanna's voice cracked. The execution is in 3 days. Hadrian returns in 2. Even if Father Matthias believes us, even if he goes to the king, will that be enough time to stop it? Margaret was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a weariness that seemed to age her another decade. There's only one way to guarantee Princess Anne's safety. Someone has to confess to the Queen's murder. Someone has to take the blame publicly, in a way that creates enough doubt about the princess's guilt that the king is forced to delay the execution pending further investigation. But no one will confess to a crime they didn't commit. That's death. No one except someone who's already dying. Margaret's smile was bitter. I have perhaps 6 months left. Consumption. I've hidden it well, but I can feel my lungs failing a little more each day. 6 months of coughing blood and wasting away, or 1 moment of courage that saves an innocent girl and destroys the man who murdered the woman I loved. Horror flooded through Joanna. You can't. You can't confess to something you didn't do. They'll execute you. Better me than Anne. Better a dying woman who's lived her life than a child whose future has been stolen. Margaret gripped Joanna's shoulders, her fingers surprisingly strong. But here's what we're going to do. I'm going to confess publicly tomorrow morning. I'm going to claim I poisoned the Queen out of old loyalty to the first Queen's memory, that I resented the new Queen taking Elizabeth's place. It's believable enough. The execution will be delayed while they investigate my claims. That gives us time. Time for what? Time for you to get this evidence to the king. Directly. Not through advisors or counselors who might be compromised. Directly to King Victor himself. Margaret pressed her satchel into Joanna's hands along with the journal pages. Tell him who you are. Tell him you're the girl from the stable. That will get his attention. Then show him everything. My evidence. Hadrian's journal pages, all of it. Make him see what's been happening under his nose. He won't believe me. I'm nobody. You're not nobody. You're the girl who saved his life and his daughter's life when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. You're proof that heroism exists in the world, and he needs to be reminded of that right now. Margaret's eyes were fierce. Can you do this? Can you be brave one more time? Joanna thought about the 14-year-old girl she had been, stealing bread to feed a dying stranger's baby. She thought about Princess Anne, alone in a cell, waiting to die for crimes committed by a man who smiled while he planned her murder. She thought about all the years she had spent being invisible, being nothing, being too afraid to matter. Yes, she whispered, I can do this. Then we move at dawn. I'll make my confession during morning mass, when the whole court is present. The chaos will give you cover to reach the king's private chambers. Father Matthias can help you navigate the castle. Between the three of us, we might just pull off a miracle." Margaret moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. The girl in the stable, the one who saved a king. She's still in there, isn't she? Still brave, still fighting. I don't feel brave. No one ever does. That's the secret they don't tell you about courage. It always feels like terror wearing a different mask. Margaret opened the door carefully, checking the corridor. "Go to Father Matthias now. Tell him everything. And Joanna, when this is over, when Hadrian is exposed and Anne is safe, don't marry him. Don't let gratitude trap you in a life of lies. You deserve better than being someone's convenient victim." Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness like smoke, leaving Joanna alone in a murderer's chambers, holding evidence that would either save a kingdom or get her killed. Outside, the cathedral bells tolled 1 in the morning. 2 more days until Hadrian returned. 3 more days until the execution. And tomorrow, a dying woman would confess to murder, to buy them time they didn't have to prove an impossible truth. Joanna clutched the satchel and the folded pages to her chest and ran. Dawn broke over the castle like a wound, all red and raw and bleeding across the horizon. Joanna stood in the sacristy with Father Matthias, the leather satchel heavy in her hands, and watched through the narrow window as the courtyard below began to fill with people. Word had spread impossibly fast. A confession was coming. Someone was taking responsibility for the Queen's murder. Margaret Thorne, Father Matthias murmured, reading through the documents Joanna had brought him. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he turned each page. "I remember her. A kind woman, devoted to the old queen. She disappeared from court after Elisabeth died. Everyone assumed she'd returned to her family estates." He looked up at Joanna, his pale blue eyes filled with sorrow. "She's really going to do this? Confess to a crime she didn't commit?" "She's dying anyway," Joanna whispered. "Consumption. She said 6 months at most. This way, her death means something. Her death means everything." The priest set down the documents carefully, as though they might shatter. "This evidence is damning. The journal pages, the financial records, the testimony Margaret collected over 20 years. Any reasonable person looking at this would see Hadrian's guilt clearly. But getting it to the king without Hadrian's supporters intercepting it, that's the challenge." Through the window, Joanna could see nobles streaming toward the chapel for morning mass. The entire court would be there, drawn by rumor and scandal like ravens to carrion. And somewhere among them would be Hadrian's allies, his bought men, ready to control the narrative and protect their master's interests, even in his absence. "The king has private chambers adjacent to the throne room," Father Matthias continued. "After Margaret's confession, there will be chaos. Everyone will be trying to understand what this means for Princess Anne's execution. In that confusion, I can get you to the king's door. But once you're inside, you'll be alone with him. A seamstress accusing his most trusted advisor of treason and multiple murders. He may not believe you. He may think you're part of some elaborate plot to destabilize the crown. Then I'll make him believe me." Joanna's voice was steadier than she felt. "I'll tell him about the stable, about the snow and the fever, and the baby who gripped my finger so tight I thought she'd never let go. I'll remind him that someone saved his life once when they had no reason to, and maybe that will be enough for him to trust me now." The cathedral bells began to toll, calling the faithful to Mass. Father Matthias placed both hands on Joanna's head in blessing. "God grant you courage, child, and wisdom," and the words to pierce through 14 years of carefully constructed lies. They entered the chapel through the side door, Joanna keeping her head down and the satchel hidden beneath her cloak. The pews were already packed with courtiers and nobles, their faces bright with anticipation. Scandal was the favorite currency of the court, and a confession of regicide was worth more than gold. Joanna found a spot in the shadows near the back, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She scanned the crowd, looking for Margaret, and finally spotted her near the front. The woman looked smaller somehow, diminished, as though she'd already begun the process of disappearing from the world. Her plain servant's dress was clean but worn, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders like a penitent's. Father Matthias began the Mass with the traditional prayers, his voice carrying through the stone chamber with surprising strength for someone so old. But Joanna couldn't focus on the words. Her mind kept racing ahead to what was coming, to the moment when Margaret would stand and speak and change everything. It happened during the confession. Father Matthias had just finished intoning the prayer for forgiveness when Margaret rose from her seat. The movement was abrupt enough that several nobles turned to stare. She walked to the center of the aisle, her steps measured and deliberate, and fell to her knees on the cold stone floor. "Father," Margaret's voice rang out clear and strong, "I must confess a mortal sin before God in this assembly. I can carry the weight of it no longer." The chapel went absolutely silent. Even the usual rustling of fabric and whispered conversations ceased. Every eye fixed on the woman kneeling in the aisle. "I am Margaret Thorne, once lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, and I am responsible for the death of Queen Catherine." The silence shattered into gasps and shocked exclamations. Father Matthias gripped the pulpit, his knuckles white. He was acting, Joanna realized, playing the part of a priest, hearing a devastating confession. But his performance was perfect. "Speak, child," Father Matthias said. "Unburden your soul." "I loved Queen Elizabeth with all my heart," Margaret continued, her voice breaking convincingly. "When she died bringing Princess Anne into this world, something inside me died too. I blamed the king for her death. I blamed him for remarrying, for replacing her, for allowing another woman to wear her crown and sleep in her bed. The hatred consumed me. For 20 years, I plotted my revenge. And finally, I acted. I put nightshade in Queen Catherine's wine. I murdered an innocent woman because I could not let go of my grief." The crowd erupted. Nobles shouted questions. Guards moved forward, uncertain what to do. And in the chaos, Joanna saw several men in fine clothing exchange looks, quick and furtive. Hadrian's people, already trying to assess what this meant, how to spin it, whether to support or refute Margaret's confession. "The princess is innocent," Margaret cried out over the noise. "Anne knew nothing of my crime. I acted alone, driven by madness and grief. Arrest me, execute me, but in God's name, release that child. She has suffered enough for sins that were never hers." 2 guards had reached Margaret now, pulling her roughly to her feet. She didn't resist, simply let herself be handled like a rag doll. But as they dragged her toward the door, her eyes found Joanna's across the crowded chapel. The message in them was clear. Now. Go now. Father Matthias descended from the pulpit, calling for calm, for order, for everyone to remain in their seats while this matter was investigated. But no one was listening. The nobles surged toward the exits, eager to spread the news, to be the first to tell others about this shocking development. Joanna let herself be swept along with the crowd, keeping her head down, just another servant caught up in the chaos. Father Matthias appeared at her elbow like a ghost, his hand on her arm guiding her away from the main flow of traffic. "This way, quickly, while everyone is distracted." They moved through a side corridor, past confused servants and shouting guards, deeper, into the administrative heart of the castle. The sounds of chaos faded behind them, replaced by the quiet that surrounded power. These were the corridors where decisions were made, where the real business of ruling happened away from public eyes. "The king will be in his study," Father Matthias whispered. "He takes his morning meal there, alone, before facing the court. The guards know me. I often bring him spiritual counsel in times of trouble. But once we're inside, I cannot help you further. This is between you and him." They reached a heavy oak door, guarded by 2 soldiers in royal livery. Father Matthias spoke to them in low tones, and after a moment's hesitation, one guard knocked and announced their presence. A voice from within, tired and aged, called for them to enter. King Victor sat at a simple wooden desk, a half-eaten piece of bread forgotten on a plate beside him. He looked nothing like the fevered, desperate man Joanna remembered from the stable. That man had been young, vital, driven by the need to protect his daughter. This man was ancient, hollowed out by grief, his crown sitting askew on thinning hair. When he looked up at them, his eyes were empty of everything except exhausted sorrow. "Father Matthias," the king said, "I assume you've heard about the confession. Margaret Thorne. I barely remember her. Can this be true? Could Anne really be innocent?" "Your Majesty," Father Matthias said gently, "this young woman has information you need to hear. Information that will change everything you think you know about your daughter's arrest." The king's gaze shifted to Joanna, and for a moment there was nothing in his face but tired indifference. Just another peasant with another story, another distraction from his overwhelming grief. Then Joanna spoke, and her voice was the voice of a 14-year-old girl standing in a frozen stable, making a choice that would define her life. "You told me, that last morning before the soldiers came, that you would never forget what I did. You said my kindness saved your life and your daughter's life, and that even though you didn't know my name, you would carry the memory of me forever." Joanna pulled back her cloak, revealing the satchel. "My name is Joanna. I was the girl in the stable, and I've come to save your daughter's life again. But this time, the danger isn't from fever or cold. It's from someone much closer to you, someone you trust, someone who has been planning your destruction for 20 years." The king stood slowly, his chair scraping against stone. His face had transformed, color returning to his cheeks, his eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "The girl from the stable," he breathed. "I searched for you. For years I searched. Where have you been?" "Here," Joanna said simply. "In your castle, invisible. Sewing your clothes and serving your food and watching everything. And I've seen the truth, Your Majesty, about who really killed the queen, about who wants Princess Anne dead, about who wants your crown." She set the satchel on his desk and pulled out the documents one by one. The journal pages with their damning sketches, Margaret's carefully compiled evidence, the financial records showing payments to assassins. 20 years of proof, laid out before a broken king who had trusted the wrong person for far too long. King Victor's hands shook as he picked up the sketch of his daughter with a noose around her neck. "Who drew this?" he whispered. "Who would plan such a thing?" "The man with the raven symbol," Joanna said. "The man who tried to kill you 14 years ago. The man you told me about in your fever, when you thought you were dying. Your nephew, Lord Hadrian." The king's face went white, then red. Then a terrible, dangerous calm settled over his features. When he looked up at Joanna, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Rage. Pure, focused, royal rage. "Tell me everything," King Victor commanded. "From the beginning. Every detail. Every moment. Leave nothing out." And Joanna did. The sun had barely climbed above the castle walls when King Victor's soldiers rode out to intercept Hadrian's carriage on the northern road. Joanna watched from the tower window, her hands pressed against the cold stone as 24 mounted guards disappeared into the morning mist like avenging angels. Beside her, Father Matthias prayed silently, his lips moving without sound. "It's done," the king had said after reading through every document, after listening to Joanna's entire story, after sitting in silence for what felt like hours while the truth settled into his bones like poison. "I've been a fool, a blind, grieving fool who let a serpent nest at my breast for 20 years. His voice had cracked then, not with weakness, but with fury so profound it made the air vibrate. "He killed Elizabeth. He killed Catherine. He tried to kill my daughter twice, 14 years apart, and I thanked him for his loyal service. Now, 3 hours later, the castle had transformed into something between a fortress and a tomb. Princess Anne had been released from the dungeons at dawn, brought directly to the king's private chambers where father and daughter had wept in each other's arms for so long that the guards outside grew uncomfortable. Margaret Thorne had been moved from the execution cell to the infirmary, her false confession pardoned, her real crime of concealing evidence from the crown forgiven in light of the truth she had helped expose. And Joanna stood in the tower, waiting for the soldiers to return with the man she had almost married. The man who had held her while she cried, who had promised her safety, who had smiled at her with eyes that held nothing but calculated manipulation. "He'll deny everything," Joanna said quietly. "He's too clever. He'll have explanations for the journal, for the documents, for all of it. He'll say the evidence was planted by enemies of the crown." "Perhaps," Father Matthias replied, "but he won't be able to explain you." The girl from the stable. The king's memory of that night has haunted him for 14 years. And now you've given him something more valuable than evidence. You've given him certainty. He knows in his soul that you're telling the truth, because you were there when he was most vulnerable, and you asked for nothing in return. The morning stretched into afternoon. Princess Anne appeared in the tower doorway, her face still bearing the marks of imprisonment, dark circles under her eyes and a hollow thinness to her cheeks. But she was alive, breathing, free. She moved to Joanna's side and looked out the window without speaking. They stood like that for a long time, the baby who had gripped Joanna's finger 14 years ago and the woman who had saved her twice. Finally Anne spoke, her voice younger than her 14 years, still carrying the tremor of a child who had looked death in the face. "Father told me what you did, what you risked. He said you could have married on. Lord Hadrian, become a lady, had everything you ever wanted, but you chose to save me instead." Anne's hand found Joanna's, their fingers intertwining. "Why? You don't even know me." Joanna thought about all the answers she could give, about justice and righteousness and doing what was right. But in the end, the truth was simpler and more complicated than any of that. "I knew you when you were 3 months old," Joanna said, "and you were perfect, innocent, deserving of life. That hasn't changed. Just because 14 years have passed, you're still that baby, still that person worth saving. And maybe I needed to prove to myself that the girl I was, the one who chose kindness over survival, she's still in here too, still fighting, still believing that sometimes you have to risk everything to be worthy of the life you've been given." Anne's grip tightened. "I won't forget this. Never. When I'm queen someday, when all of this is just a terrible memory, I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. You won't be invisible anymore. You won't be just a seamstress. I'll be me." Joanna interrupted gently. "That's enough. That's always been enough. I just forgot for a while." The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold when the soldiers finally returned. Joanna saw them first, the mounted guards, their formation tight and military, surrounding a single carriage. Hadrian's carriage. She couldn't see inside from this distance, couldn't tell if he had come, peacefully or in chains. But the carriage was moving slowly, deliberately, toward the castle gates. "He's here," Joanna whispered, and her whole body went cold. King Victor had ordered Joanna to remain in the tower during Hadrian's arrest and interrogation. "You've done enough," he had said. "More than enough. Let me handle this final piece. You don't need to see his face again." But Joanna knew she had to be there, had to witness the end of this, had to see with her own eyes that the monster was truly caged. She descended the tower stairs with Princess Anne and Father Matthias flanking her like guards. They moved through corridors that suddenly felt different, lighter somehow, as though a poison had been drawn from the castle's veins. Servants who had never looked at Joanna before now stepped aside with respect, their eyes filled with something she had never seen directed at her. Acknowledgement. She mattered. She had changed the course of history. The invisible girl had become undeniable. The throne room was packed with nobles and advisors when they arrived. King Victor sat on his throne, his crown straight now, his bearing regal and terrible. This was not the broken man from this morning. This was a king who had remembered what power meant, what justice demanded. At his right hand stood the captain of the guard, at his left, the kingdom's chief magistrate. The doors opened and Hadrian entered. He was in chains, heavy iron shackles at his wrists and ankles, but he walked as though he were still the king's trusted advisor, his back straight, his expression calm. His eyes swept the room, taking in the assembled witnesses, the grim faces, the atmosphere of judgment, and then his gaze found Joanna, standing near the throne beside Princess Anne. For just a moment, his mask slipped. Joanna saw confusion, then understanding, then fury so pure it was almost admirable in its intensity. He had underestimated her, had thought her too grateful, too beaten down by life, too desperate for his approval to ever act against him. That miscalculation had destroyed him. "Lord Hadrian," King Victor's voice echoed through the chamber, "you stand accused of high treason, of the murder of 2 queens, of conspiracy to murder the heir to the throne, and of attempting to assassinate your king. How do you answer these charges?" "With shock and dismay, Your Majesty." Hadrian's voice was smooth as silk, genuinely bewildered. "I don't understand. I've served the crown faithfully. For 20 years. Who has made these absurd accusations? What evidence could possibly support such madness?" The king gestured, and a servant brought forward the leather satchel. One by one, the documents were displayed. The journal pages, the financial records, Margaret's testimony. Hadrian examined each piece with growing alarm that looked entirely genuine. He was good, Joanna realized. Even now, facing irrefutable proof, he could have convinced half the room that this was all a terrible mistake. "This journal is not mine," Hadrian said firmly. "These pages have been forged. Anyone could have drawn these sketches, planted this evidence. Your Majesty, you know me. You know my loyalty. Would I truly be foolish enough to document my crimes in such detail? This is clearly the work of someone trying to frame me, to remove me from my position of trust so they can manipulate you themselves." "That's what I thought too," King Victor said, "until I heard testimony from someone I trust." "Absolutely. Someone who has no reason to lie, no motive except the truth. Someone who saved my life once before, and has now saved my daughter's life as well." He gestured to Joanna. "Come forward, child." Joanna's legs felt like water, but she moved forward anyway, stepping into the center of the throne room where everyone could see her. Hadrian's eyes followed her, and she saw him calculating, trying to understand how this piece fit into the puzzle. "Tell them," King Victor commanded gently. "Tell them what you heard 14 years ago. Tell them who tried to kill me and my infant daughter that winter night." Joanna's voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each word. She told them about the stable, about the dying man's fever dreams, about the accusations he had made. "The raven," she said, pointing to the brooch still pinned to Hadrian's chest. "He said the raven brought the nightshade, his brother's son, the man who wanted the throne. A fever dream from a dying man 14 years ago." Hadrian laughed, but there was desperation in it now. "Your Majesty, you would condemn me based on the ravings of—" "But you weren't dying," King Victor interrupted. "Thanks to this girl I lived to remember, and I do remember, Hadrian. I remember accusing you in my delirium. I remember the nightshade that had been in my wine at dinner, the dinner you had personally overseen. I remember fleeing with Anne, terrified that you would find us and finish what you'd started. I remember everything, and I've spent 14 years trying to convince myself I was wrong, that fever had made me paranoid, that my nephew couldn't possibly be capable of such betrayal." The king stood, and the room seemed to shrink around him. "But I wasn't wrong. I was right then, and I've been a fool ever since for doubting my own instincts, for letting you back into my confidence, for trusting you with my grief and my daughter's safety, for nearly allowing you to murder another innocent woman and steal my crown." Hadrian's composure finally cracked. His face twisted with rage, with frustrated ambition, with the fury of a man who had been patient for 20 years, only to have victory snatched away at the last moment by a seamstress he had dismissed as inconsequential. "She's lying!" he screamed. "That peasant is lying. She's nothing. Nobody. She has no proof, no credibility, no—" "She has my trust," King Victor said quietly, and that is worth more than all your carefully crafted schemes. Guards, take him to the dungeons. The cell my daughter just vacated will suit him well. His trial will be held in 3 days, and if the magistrate finds him guilty, as I'm certain he will, Lord Hadrian will hang for his crimes." The guards moved forward, but Hadrian twisted away, his chains rattling. He looked at Joanna one last time, and the hatred in his eyes was pure enough to kill. "You've destroyed yourself," he hissed. "You could have been Lady Joanna, could have had everything. But you chose this, chose poverty and obscurity and nothing. You're a fool, a sentimental, pathetic fool." "Maybe," Joanna replied, "but I'm a fool who can sleep at night. Can you say the same?" They dragged him away, his shouts echoing through the stone corridors until distance swallowed them whole. The throne room remained silent for a long moment, everyone processing what had just occurred. Then King Victor descended from his throne and walked directly to Joanna. He knelt before her. This king, who ruled a kingdom and took her scarred, work-roughened hands in his. "Twice you have saved my daughter's life," he said. "Once when you were a child yourself, with nothing to gain, and again, now, when you risked everything you had built. The debt I owe you cannot be repaid. But I can offer you this, a place in this castle, not as a servant, but as family. A title, lands, security for the rest of your life. Anything you want, anything at all, you need only ask." Joanna looked at him. This man. She had saved, and then at Princess Anne standing beside the throne, and then at Father Matthias smiling gently near the door. She thought about what Hadrian had said, about how she had thrown away her chance at becoming Lady Joanna, and she realized he had been wrong about one thing. She hadn't thrown anything away. She had chosen something better. "I don't want a title," Joanna said softly. "I don't want lands or riches or to be called lady. I just want to matter, to be seen, to know that when I die, whenever that is, I'll be remembered not as the orphan who survived or the seamstress who was almost tricked, but as the person who chose courage when it was easier to choose comfort." Is that strange? "It's the sanest thing I've heard in years," King Victor replied. He stood, still holding her hands. "Then you shall have that and more. You will be remembered, Joanna, in histories and songs and stories, as the girl who saved a kingdom twice with nothing but kindness and courage, as the invisible one who changed everything." 3 days later, Hadrian hung in the castle courtyard. Joanna didn't watch. She had seen enough of death and darkness. Instead, she sat in the gardens with Princess Anne, teaching the young girl how to mend clothing, their hands working side by side in the sunshine. Margaret Thorne lived another 4 months, spending her final days in comfort in the castle, honored as a hero rather than dying in shame. Father Matthias performed her funeral rites, and the Adi king himself attended. And Joanna? She stayed in the castle, not as a seamstress, but as companion to Princess Anne, watching the girl grow into a woman who would one day be a queen. She never married, never wanted to, after Hadrian. But she was never alone, never invisible, never forgotten. Years later, when Anne took the throne, her first official act was to commission a statue. It stood in the castle courtyard, bronze and eternal. A young girl holding a baby with an inscription that read, "For Joanna, who proved that the smallest acts of courage can change the course of kingdoms." And every person who passed it, noble or peasant, rich or poor, touched the statue's base for luck and whispered a prayer, that they too might have the courage to choose right over easy, compassion over comfort, truth over safety, that they too might matter the way Joanna had mattered, the way everyone deserved to matter. Joanna's story forces us to ask ourselves the hardest question we'll ever face. What would you sacrifice to do what's right? When comfort and justice stand on opposite sides of an impossible choice, when speaking the truth means losing everything you've ever wanted, when saving someone else means destroying yourself, what do you choose? We like to believe we'd be heroes, that we'd stand up for the innocent, no matter the cost. But Joanna shows us that heroism isn't a grand gesture made in a single moment. It's a terrified girl stealing bread for strangers. It's a woman breaking into a murderer's chambers with shaking hands. It's choosing to matter, even when the world has spent your entire life telling you that you don't. The truth is, most of us will never face a choice as dramatic as Joanna's. We'll never have to decide between marrying a killer or saving a princess. But every single day, we face smaller versions of that same choice. Do we speak up when we see injustice, even if it costs us something? Do we help someone in need, even when no one is watching? Do we choose courage over comfort, truth over safety, compassion over convenience? Joanna was invisible for 28 years, but the moment she decided her conscience mattered more than her comfort, she changed the course of a kingdom. What could you change if you stopped being invisible? What injustice could you correct if you found the courage to act? The world is full of people waiting for someone else to be brave. Maybe that someone is you. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over fear, then please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that will touch your heart and challenge your soul. Because stories like Joanna's don't just entertain us, they remind us who we can become when we refuse to stay invisible any longer.